The woman they called a whore stood at the edge of Georgetown, Colorado in 1878, watching the snow-capped peaks turn gold in the morning light, and she wondered if God could see her through the judgment that hung around her neck like a noose. Annie Preston had arrived in this silver mining town 3 months ago with nothing but the clothes on her back and a past that followed her like a shadow, and already the proper ladies crossed the street when they saw her coming. Already the preacher had named her from the pulpit without saying her name. Already the men who visited her small cabin at night proclaimed her soul lost during the daylight hours. She did not feel lost, though perhaps she should have, and she wondered sometimes if that made her more damned or less. The cold bit through her thin shawl as she made her way down the muddy main street, past the assayer's office and the general store where Mrs. Henderson stood in the doorway and deliberately turned her back. Annie kept her head high because she had learned years ago that cowering only made the vultures circle closer. She needed flour and coffee, needed them badly enough to endure the stares and whispers, needed them because a body had to eat even when the world decided that body was not worth common decency. Inside the store, she moved quickly through the narrow aisles, gathering what little she could afford with the coin she had earned washing laundry for the Chinese workers who lived on the far side of town, the only people who did not seem to care about her supposed sins. She was counting out her money at the counter when she heard the door open behind her and felt the temperature in the room shift the way it did when something dangerous entered a space. Thomas Henderson, who owned the store with his righteous wife, cleared his throat. "I am going to have to ask you not to come in here anymore, Miss Preston. My wife, she does not feel comfortable with your sort of customer." Annie's fingers tightened on the coins in her palm. "I have money, same as anyone else." "It is not about money," Henderson said, though his eyes lingered on the coins with clear regret. "It is about morals, decency, you understand." "I understand that I need to eat, Mr. Henderson. I understand that I have never stolen from you or caused trouble in your establishment. I understand that my money spends the same as Mrs. Henderson's, though perhaps mine was harder earned." "Now you see here," Henderson began, his face reddening, but another voice cut through the tension like a blade through butter. "I will buy her goods and mine together," the voice said, deep and quiet and carrying an authority that made Henderson's mouth snap shut. "You can take issue with me if you have objections to the transaction." Annie turned to see the man who had spoken, and for a moment her breath caught in her chest in a way that had nothing to do with fear or anger. He was tall, this stranger, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes the color of the sky just before a storm. He wore the practical clothing of someone who worked with horses and cattle, his boots dusty from travel, his hat held respectfully in his hands. But it was his face that held her, not handsome in any conventional way, but striking in its directness, in the way he looked at her as though she were a person rather than a problem. "Mr. Everett," Henderson said, and there was a note of uncertainty in his voice now, "I did not realize you had returned to Georgetown." "Just arrived this morning," the man said. "Drove a herd up from New Mexico for the Bartlett Ranch. Now, are you going to sell these goods, or do I need to take my considerable business elsewhere? I recall the mercantile on the next block was looking to expand." Henderson's jaw worked silently for a moment. Then he nodded stiffly. "Of course, Mr. Everett. I meant no offense." The stranger, this Everett, placed his own items on the counter alongside Annie's meager supplies, then added a bag of sugar and a tin of peaches. "The lady will need these as well," he said, ignoring Annie's soft protest. He paid for everything without fanfare, counted out the bills with steady hands, and gathered the parcels into his arms before turning to Annie. "May I walk you home, miss? These are heavy and the street is muddy." Annie found her voice, though it came out smaller than she intended. "You do not have to do this. You do not know what they say about me." His gray eyes met hers directly. "I know that every person who walks this earth carries the same worth in the eyes of heaven, whatever small men might declare otherwise. I know that you were being treated poorly for no good reason I could see, and I know that these parcels are indeed heavy. The rest is none of my concern unless you choose to make it so." Something in Annie's chest, something that had been clenched tight for so long she had forgotten it was there, loosened slightly. My cabin is on the eastern edge of town. It is not far. They walked in silence for a while, navigating the rutted street where snowmelt mixed with mud and horse droppings. Annie was acutely aware of the stares that followed them, of the way conversations stopped as they passed. Beside her, Everett seemed unbothered by the attention, his stride easy and unhurried. "You are called Everett?" she asked finally, because the silence had begun to feel heavy with all the things she did not know how to say. "Jackson Everett," he confirmed, "though most just call me Jack. I work horses mostly, break them for saddle, train them for cattle work. I was born in Kansas, but I have been moving west since I was old enough to sit a horse properly." "Annie Preston," she offered in return, though he likely already knew. Likely had heard whatever ugly stories Georgetown had invented about her past. "I came from Missouri." "What brought you to Colorado?" His tone was conversational, genuinely curious rather than prying. Annie considered lying, considered offering one of the safe stories she had rehearsed in her mind during the long journey west. But something about this man, about the way he had stood up for her in the store without knowing anything about her, made her want to offer truth instead. "I was married," she said slowly. "My husband was not a kind man. When he drank, which was often, he used his fists to express his opinions about how I kept house or cooked supper or breathed too loudly. One night he came home drunk and mean, and I fought back. Broke a bottle over his head when he came at me with his belt. I thought I had killed him, so I ran, took what little money we had, and ran west as far as the train would carry me." She waited for judgment, for Everett to set down her parcels and walk away, for his expression to close the way all expressions closed when people learned what she was. Instead, he nodded slowly. "Did you kill him?" "I do not know," Annie admitted. "I did not stay to find out. Perhaps that makes me a coward." "That makes you someone who wanted to live," Everett said firmly. "No shame in that, Miss Preston, no shame at all." They had reached her cabin, a tiny structure at the edge of town that leaned slightly to one side and let in the wind through gaps in the boards. Annie had stuffed rags in the worst of the cracks, had made it as comfortable as she could with the little she had, but she was suddenly aware of how it must look to someone from outside, how shabby and desperate. Everett set the parcels on her small table without comment on the poverty of the place. "Miss Preston," he said, turning to face her, "I am going to be in Georgetown for a few weeks at least. The Bartlett Ranch needs help breaking some wild horses they acquired, and I have agreed to do the work. I wonder if you would allow me to call on you. As a friend, if nothing else. You should not have to face the Henderson sword alone." Annie stared at him, searching his face for the ulterior motive, for the expectation that must be lurking beneath the kind words. Men did not help women like her without expecting payment of a particular sort. But his expression remained open, honest, waiting for her answer without presumption. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why would you want to associate with me? You heard what Henderson implied. The whole town believes I am a fallen woman, that I sell myself to survive. Your reputation will suffer if you are seen with me." Everett put his hat back on, adjusted it carefully. "Miss Preston, I have found in my 30 years of living that reputation is something men hide behind when they want to justify cruelty. I do not require the good opinion of people who would let a woman go hungry because they disapprove of her circumstances. As for why, well, perhaps I'm tired of eating alone." Before Annie could respond, he tipped his hat and walked back toward town, leaving her standing in the doorway of her leaning cabin with tears threatening to spill down her cheeks for the first time since she had arrived in this cold, judgmental place. True to his word, Jackson Everett appeared at her door 2 days later just as the sun was setting behind the mountains. He carried a covered basket and wore a smile that seemed almost shy. "I brought supper," he said. "I am staying at the boarding house, and Mrs. Chen always makes far too much food. I thought you might help me with these dumplings before they go to waste." Annie knew this was a polite fiction, knew that he had probably paid extra for the food he claimed was surplus, but she was hungry enough and lonely enough not to care. She invited him in, cleared the small table, and they ate together while he told her about the horses he was working with, about a particularly stubborn mare who had decided that bucking was preferable to cooperation. "She has spirit, though," he said, his eyes lighting up as he talked. "You can see it in the way she moves. She does not want to be broken. She wants to be understood. There is a difference, though not every horse trainer recognizes it." "Is that your philosophy, then?" Annie asked. "Understanding rather than breaking?" "With horses, yes. With people, too, I suppose." He looked at her over the rim of his tin cup. "I think most creatures, human or otherwise, respond better to patience than to force. But maybe that makes me soft in the head? My father certainly thought so." "Your father was a horseman, too?" Everett's expression darkened slightly. "My father was a drunk who took out his failures on anything weaker than himself. I left home at 15 and never looked back. Some legacies are meant to be abandoned." Annie understood that, understood it in her bones. "My mother told me I should be grateful for my husband," she said quietly. "Said that a woman alone in the world was worse than a woman with a mean husband. Said I should learn to keep my mouth shut and my head down. When I told her he was hurting me, she said I must be provoking him somehow." "Families can be the cruelest judges," Everett said softly. "They know exactly where to place the blade to make it hurt the most. I am sorry your mother failed you in that way." They talked until the candle on the table burned low, about everything and nothing, about their childhoods and their dreams and the strange paths that had brought them both to this silver mining town in the Colorado mountains. When Everett finally stood to leave, he paused in the doorway. "May I come back tomorrow?" Annie smiled, and it felt strange on her face, unfamiliar. "Yes, I would like that." The pattern repeated over the following days. Everett would work with the horses during daylight hours, and in the evenings, he would appear at Annie's door with food or firewood or simply his company. They played cards by candlelight, taught each other songs from their different childhoods, shared stories that grew more personal as trust built slowly between them like a house raised beam by careful beam. On the fourth visit, Annie worked up the courage to ask the question that had been nagging at her. "Jack, why are you really doing this? And please do not tell me again that it is simply kindness. I am not fool enough to believe that kindness comes without complication in this world." He was quiet for a long moment, studying his hands where they rested on the table. "When I was 16, he said finally, "I was working on a ranch in Kansas. There was a woman there, a widow named Sarah, who worked in the ranch kitchen. The owner's son took a liking to her, kept bothering her, making crude suggestions. She rejected him over and over, stayed professional even when he got angry about it. One day he told his father that she had stolen money from the house. It was a lie. Everyone knew it was a lie. But the old man believed his son because that is what fathers do. They fired her, ran her off the property without even her final wages. I watched it happen, and I did nothing. I was young and scared of losing my position, scared of standing up to men with power. I told myself it was not my business." He looked up then, met Annie's eyes directly. 2 weeks later, we heard that Sarah had been found dead in a ravine. Whether she jumped or fell or was pushed, nobody could say for certain. But I knew that my silence had been a stone that helped build her coffin. I swore then that I would not stand by again when I saw injustice done. So when I walked into that store and saw Henderson treating you like you were less than human for reasons I could not fathom, I heard myself speak up because I owed a debt to a woman I could never repay. Does that answer satisfy you?" Annie reached across the table and placed her hand over his, the first time she had voluntarily touched him. "Yes," she said softly, "that answers me." His hand turned under hers, palm to palm, and his fingers curled around hers with a gentleness that made her throat tight. They sat like that in the candlelight, hands clasped, while outside the wind moved through the pine trees and somewhere a coyote sang to the rising moon. The trouble came, as trouble always does in small towns where righteousness and hypocrisy walk hand in hand. Annie was at the creek washing her laundry when 3 women approached. their faces set in identical expressions of pinched disapproval. She recognized them all, the wives of prominent men in Georgetown, women who had made their opinions of Annie clear through cut direct and hostile stares. Mrs. Henderson led the small delegation. "Miss Preston, we need to speak with you about a delicate matter." Annie wrung out the shirt she was washing and laid it carefully on a rock. "Mrs. Henderson, it has come to our attention that you have been entertaining Mr. Jackson Everett in your home, alone, in the evenings." Mrs. Henderson's voice dripped with implications, with assumptions that made Annie's hands clench into fists in the cold water. "Mr. Everett is my friend. We share meals and conversation. I was not aware that either activity was illegal in the state of Colorado." "Do not be obtuse," snapped Mrs. Wallace, the banker's wife. "You know perfectly well what people are saying, that you have ensnared a good man with your feminine wiles, that you are using your skills to trap him into some sort of arrangement." Annie stood slowly, water dripping from her hands. "My skills? You mean the skills you all assume I possess based on nothing but your own cruel imaginations? I wash laundry for money, Mrs. Wallace. I sew and mend. Those are my skills. Whatever else you have decided about me exists only in your own minds." "We know what you are," Mrs. Henderson said flatly. "We know why you came here, running from some scandal back east. We know that decent women do not end up alone in towns like this without reason. And now you are corrupting Mr. Everett, leading him astray with your influence." Corrupting him. Annie felt something hot and dangerous rising in her chest, felt the anger she had been swallowing for months threatening to spill over. "Mr. Everett is a grown man with his own mind and his own choices. He has shown me kindness in a place where kindness is apparently rationed only to those deemed worthy by self-appointed judges. If that bothers you, perhaps you should examine why the simple act of treating another human being with decency seems so foreign that it must be explained as corruption." "How dare you?" breathed Mrs. Wallace. "How dare you speak to us in that tone? We came here to warn you, to give you a chance to leave town quietly before we are forced to take more serious measures." "What measures?" Annie demanded. "What exactly do you plan to do to me? I have broken no laws. I have harmed no one. My only crime seems to be existing in a way that makes you uncomfortable." Mrs. Henderson stepped closer, and there was something ugly in her face now, something that had shed the veneer of Christian charity to reveal the petty cruelty beneath. "We will make sure you cannot find work anywhere in this town. We will tell our husbands to deny you credit at every store. We will make your life so difficult that you will have no choice but to leave or to become exactly what we already know you to be. And Mr. Everett will see you for what you truly are, will understand that he was bewitched by a desperate woman with nothing to offer but the use of her body." Annie felt the words like blows, felt them landing in all the soft, vulnerable places she had tried to protect. But she held her ground, kept her voice steady even as her hands shook. "Get away from me, all of you. Go back to your comfortable homes and your comfortable lies about your own goodness. But know this, I am not leaving. I have as much right to be in Georgetown as any of you. And if you try to destroy me, I will fight back with every breath in my body." The women left in a rustle of skirts and offended dignity, but Annie knew the threat was real. She knew what people with power could do to those without it, knew that she was balanced on a knife's edge between survival and disaster. That evening, when Jack arrived with his usual basket of food, Annie told him everything. He listened in silence, his face growing darker as she spoke, his jaw tight with suppressed anger. "They have no right," he said when she finished. "They have no right to treat you this way." "They have every right," Annie corrected wearily. "They have the right that comes from money and marriage and social standing. I have nothing, Jack. I am nothing in the eyes of this town, and now I am going to cost you your standing too if you continue to associate with me." Jack stood abruptly, paced the small confines of the cabin like a caged animal. "To hell with my standing. To hell with all of them and their poisonous judgments." Annie, I have something I need to say to you, and maybe this is not the right time, but I think you need to hear it. He stopped in front of her, reached down, and took both her hands in his. These past 2 weeks, getting to know you, spending time with you, they have been the best weeks I have had in more years than I can count. You are sharp and funny and strong in ways those women could never understand. You have survived things that would have broken lesser people, and you did it with your humanity intact, with your capacity for kindness still alive. They say your soul is lost, that you are beyond redemption. But I look at you and I see someone who has never been lost at all. Someone who knew exactly who she was, even when the world tried to tell her different. Annie felt tears streaming down her face, felt the words reaching into places that had been frozen and bringing them painfully back to life. Jack, I am not what you think I am. I am damaged. I am running from things I cannot escape. I will only bring you trouble. Then bring me trouble, he said fiercely. I would rather have trouble with you than peace without you. Annie Preston, I am falling in love with you. Maybe I have been since the moment I saw you standing in that store, refusing to be made small by small men. And I know this is fast. I know we have only known each other a short time, but when you have lived the life I have lived, you learn to recognize the real thing when it appears. You are the real thing. I am falling in love with you too, Annie whispered, because it was true, because she had been fighting the feeling for days now, trying to protect herself from the inevitable hurt. I am terrified of what that means. Then we will be terrified together, Jack said, and kissed her. It was gentle, that first kiss, tentative as a question waiting for an answer. Annie answered by wrapping her arms around his neck and pulling him closer, by opening her mouth under his and tasting the hope that she had thought was dead. They kissed until the candle burned down to nothing, until the cabin was dark except for the silver moonlight coming through the window, and when they finally broke apart, Annie rested her forehead against his chest and listened to the steady beating of his heart. What do we do now? She asked. Now, Jack said. We show this town that their opinions hold no power over us. We walk down that main street together in broad daylight. We attend the church social next week, and we dance where everyone can see. We live our lives as though we have nothing to be ashamed of because we do not. They will make it hell for us. They will try, Jack agreed. But Annie, I have faced down wild horses and angry bulls and men with guns. I have survived my father's fists and winters so cold they froze the blood in your veins. I can survive the disapproval of hypocrites, especially when I have something worth surviving for. The church social the following Saturday was held in the meeting hall attached to the small Catholic church on the hill. Annie had not planned to attend, had learned long ago that such gatherings were not meant for women like her, but Jack insisted. He appeared at her door wearing his best shirt, his hair still damp from washing, and offered his arm with a formal bow that made her laugh despite her nerves. Miss Preston, would you do me the honor of accompanying me to the social this evening? Mr. Everett, you are ridiculous. Ridiculously handsome, ridiculously charming. Ridiculously stubborn, Annie said, but she took his arm, wrapped her own best shawl around her shoulders, and walked with him into town as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and gold. The hall was already crowded when they arrived, filled with the families who formed the social backbone of Georgetown. Conversation stumbled and died as they entered, replaced by a silence so profound that Annie could hear the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Every eye in the room turned toward them, and in those eyes she saw shock, disapproval, and in some cases outright hostility. Jack seemed unbothered. He guided Annie to the refreshment table, poured them both cups of punch, and struck up a conversation with old Mr. Bartlett, the rancher he was working for, as though nothing unusual was happening at all. Fine horses you have, Mr. Bartlett, Jack said easily. That bay mare is coming along particularly well. Should have her ready for saddle work by the end of next week. Bartlett looked uncomfortable. his eyes darting between Jack and Annie and the crowd of watching faces. That is good to hear, Everett. Very good. Miss Preston, have you met Mr. Bartlett? He owns the Bar 7 Ranch just west of town. Mr. Bartlett, this is Miss Annie Preston, a friend of mine from Missouri originally. Annie understood what Jack was doing, understood that he was forcing the social niceties, making it awkward for Bartlett to be rude. She held out her hand with as much grace as she could muster. Mr. Bartlett, a pleasure. Bartlett had no choice but to take her hand, to nod stiffly in acknowledgement. Miss Preston. The moment broke the paralysis that had gripped the room, and gradually conversation resumed, though Annie could feel the weight of judgment pressing down on her from all sides. Mrs. Henderson and her friends clustered together near the far wall, their heads bent close in whispered conference. The preacher, Father O'Brien, watched from his position near the door with an expression that was difficult to read. When the music started, Jack set down his cup and turned to Annie with a smile. Dance with me? Jack, people are staring. Let them stare. I want to dance with the prettiest woman in the room, and I do not give a damn who disapproves. He held out his hand, waiting, and after a moment's hesitation, Annie took it. They moved onto the floor together, and Jack swept her into a waltz with surprising skill. He was a good dancer, sure-footed and confident, and despite herself, Annie felt some of her tension ease as they moved together in time to the music. You are full of surprises, Mr. Everett, she murmured. Where did a horseman learn to waltz? My mother taught me before she died, Jack said. She said that any man worth his salt should know how to dance properly with a lady. I think she hoped it would civilize me, make me into something finer than my father. Not sure it worked, but I remember the steps. They completed the waltz without incident, though no other couples joined them on the floor. When the music ended, Jack led Annie back to the refreshment table, and they spent the rest of the evening standing together, presenting a united front against the cold shoulders and cutting looks. As they were preparing to leave, Father O'Brien approached them. He was a middle-aged man with kind eyes and the weathered face of someone who had spent years in the mountains. Mr. Everett, Miss Preston, might I have a word? Annie's stomach clenched, expecting another lecture about morality and propriety, but the priest's expression was not unkind. They followed him to a quiet corner of the hall, away from curious ears. I want to apologize, Father O'Brien said quietly. I have heard the way some members of this congregation have been treating you, Miss Preston, and I am ashamed to say I did not intervene as I should have. I allowed gossip and judgment to flourish in a place that should offer refuge and compassion. That was wrong of me. Annie was so surprised she could not immediately find words. Jack spoke instead. That is decent of you to say, Father. It is the truth, and truth should be spoken even when it is uncomfortable. The priest turned to Annie. Miss Preston, I do not know your full story, and I do not need to. What I know is that you are a member of this community, and as such, you deserve to be treated with the same Christian charity we extend to everyone else. If you need anything, if anyone troubles you further, please come to me. I will do what I can to help. Thank you, Annie managed. That means more than you might realize. Father O'Brien nodded. We are all sinners in the eyes of God, Miss Preston. Anyone who claims otherwise is a liar or a fool. The measure of a soul is not in its perfection, but in its capacity for love and growth. I think your soul is doing just fine. They walked home through the cool night air, and Annie leaned against Jack's solid warmth as the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. That was not as terrible as I feared it would be, she admitted. No, though I suspect we will pay for our boldness in other ways. The Henderson sort do not take defiance lightly. Jack's arm tightened around her shoulders. But we will face whatever comes together. I am not going anywhere, Annie. I hope you understand that. I am beginning to, Annie said softly. I am beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, I am allowed to have this, allowed to have you. You are allowed to have anything you want, Jack said firmly. You are allowed to have love and joy and peace and every good thing this world offers. The fact that you have been told otherwise your whole life does not make it true. They reached Annie's cabin, and this time when Jack kissed her goodnight, there was promise in it, a suggestion of futures that extended beyond the next day or week. Annie watched him walk away toward town, his figure gradually disappearing into the darkness, and she felt something unfamiliar blooming in her chest. It took her a moment to recognize it as hope. The retaliation came 3 days later. Annie arrived at the boarding house where she usually collected laundry from the Chinese workers to find her services were no longer needed. The foreman, a kind man named Chen, who had always treated her fairly, looked genuinely distressed as he delivered the news. "I am so sorry, Miss Preston. The owners, they say they cannot use you anymore. They say it is bad for business, that other white families complain about you being here. I argue. I tell them you do good work, but they do not listen. They give me different orders." Annie had expected this, but the reality of it still hit hard. The laundry money had been her only reliable income, the thing that kept her fed and housed. "I understand, Mr. Chen. Thank you for trying." "You are good, woman," Chen said earnestly. "Those people, they do not know what they say. They see only what they want to see, not what is true." Annie managed a smile for his kindness, then walked back to her cabin feeling as though the walls were closing in around her. She had a little money saved, enough for maybe 2 weeks if she was very careful, but after that she did not know what she would do. The thought of leaving Georgetown, of putting Jack behind her and running again made her physically ill. But the thought of staying and slowly starving was not much better. She was sitting at her table trying to calculate impossible sums with her meager finances when Jack burst through the door without knocking. His face was flushed with anger, his gray eyes stormy. "I heard what happened at the boarding house. This is because of me, because we went to that damn social together." "No," Annie said firmly. "This is because of people who measure worth in respectability and find me wanting. You are not responsible for their cruelty, Jack. Do not take that burden on yourself." "Then what do we do?" "I can give you money. I have some saved, but I know you are too proud to accept charity." "It is not about pride," Annie said wearily. "It is about the fact that I need to be able to take care of myself. If I let you support me, I become exactly what they all say I am, a kept woman, a burden, something to be ashamed of." Jack pulled out a chair and sat across from her, reached across and took her hands in his. "Then marry me." Annie's breath caught. "What?" "Marry me," Jack repeated. "I know this is fast. I know we have only known each other a month, but Annie, I love you. I love you enough to know that I want to spend whatever years I have left on this earth making sure you never have to face the Henderson sword alone again. Marry me, and we will face all of this together as husband and wife. No one can question your respectability then. No one can use your circumstances against you. Jack, you do not have to do this. You do not have to marry me out of some misguided sense of obligation or protection." "I do not want to marry you out of obligation," Jack said intensely. "I want to marry you because when I think about my future, you are in every corner of it. I want to marry you because you make me laugh and you make me think and you make me want to be a better man than I have been. I want to marry you because every minute I am not with you feels like wasted time. So please, Annie Preston, say yes. Make me the happiest horseman in Colorado and say you will be my wife." Annie looked at him, at this man who had appeared in her life like an answer to prayers she had been afraid to speak aloud. She thought about the life they could build together, about the possibility of safety and love and belonging. She thought about the risks, about the ways this could go wrong, about the fact that her past might come looking for her someday and what that would mean for him. But mostly she thought about how it felt to be loved by someone who saw her clearly and loved her anyway, who did not need her to be perfect or pristine or anything other than exactly who she was. "Yes," she said, and watched his face transform with joy. "Yes, I will marry you, Jackson Everett." He pulled her into his arms, kissed her with a passion that made her dizzy, and when they broke apart, they were both laughing like children. "We will do it right," Jack promised. I will talk to Father O'Brien tomorrow, arrange for a proper ceremony. I will buy you a ring, the prettiest one the jeweler has. I will make sure everyone in this town knows that you are my wife, that you are under my protection, that anyone who speaks ill of you will answer to me." "I do not need fancy things," Annie protested. "I just need you." "I know, but I want to give you fancy things anyway. I want to give you everything you have been denied, everything you deserve. Let me do that, Annie. Let me spend the rest of my life making up for all the ways the world has failed you." They were married 3 weeks later in the small Catholic church on the hill. Annie wore a simple dress of cream-colored cotton that she had sewn herself, working by candlelight in the evenings to get the stitches just right. Jack wore his best suit, purchased new from the general store despite Henderson's obvious reluctance to serve him. Father O'Brien performed the ceremony in front of a small gathering that included Mr. and Mrs. Bartlett, Chen, and several of the Chinese workers and a handful of other townspeople who had decided that their affection for Jack outweighed their disapproval of Annie. Mrs. Henderson and her friends were notably absent, as were most of the supposedly respectable families of Georgetown. But Annie found that she did not care. Not when she was standing in front of the altar with Jack's hands warm around hers, not when she was promising to love and honor and cherish this man who had chosen her against all reason. "Do you, Annie Marie Preston, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Father O'Brien asked. "I do," Annie said clearly, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "And do you, Jackson Thomas Everett, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do," Jack said, and his voice was fierce with certainty. "Then by the power vested in me by the Church and the state of Colorado, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride, Mr. Everett." Jack kissed her thoroughly, deeply, in a way that made several people in the congregation cough awkwardly. When they broke apart, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "Hello, Mrs. Everett." "Hello, Mr. Everett," Annie said, and felt joy bubble up in her chest like champagne. They celebrated with a modest meal at the boarding house, Chen having insisted on hosting a dinner in their honor. The food was delicious, spicy, and unfamiliar and wonderful, and Annie ate until she was pleasantly full while listening to Jack swap stories with the other men about horses and cattle and the vagaries of ranch work. As the evening wound down, Jack pulled her aside. "I rented us a room at the hotel for tonight. Tomorrow we can figure out more permanent arrangements, but tonight I want to do this properly. Want to carry you over the threshold like a proper husband." Annie felt her cheeks heat. "Jack, we do not need to. I mean, if you want to wait." "I do not want to wait," Jack said, his gray eyes darkening, "but only if you want this too. I will not rush you, Annie. We have all the time in the world." "I want this," Annie said honestly. "I want you. I am nervous. My husband, my first husband, he never made it pleasant. It was always something he took rather than something we shared." Jack's jaw tightened. "I am not him. I will never be him. If I do anything that makes you uncomfortable, you tell me and I stop immediately. Do you understand? This is about both of us, about pleasure and connection and love. I want you to feel good. Annie, that is the only thing that matters to me." They walked to the hotel through the cool evening air, their hands linked, and true to his word, Jack carried Annie over the threshold of their room despite her laughing protests. He set her down gently, and suddenly the laughter faded, replaced by a tension that was not fear but anticipation. Jack cupped her face in his hands, kissed her slowly, thoroughly, until Annie was pressing against him and making small sounds in her throat. His hands moved to the buttons on her dress, pausing at each one to make sure she was still with him, still willing. Annie helped him with trembling fingers, let the dress pool at her feet, stood before him in just her chemise and stockings. "You are so beautiful," Jack breathed. "Annie, you take my breath away." She helped him with his own clothes, marveling at the solid warmth of him, at the muscles earned through years of physical labor. When they finally came together in the narrow hotel bed, it was with a tenderness that made Annie weep. Jack was patient and gentle and attentive, reading her responses, adjusting his approach, making sure she was with him at every moment. When they finally joined together completely, Annie gasped at the sensation at how different this was from anything she had experienced before. This was not taking but sharing, not pain but pleasure, not duty but desire. Jack moved slowly, carefully, whispering endearments against her skin, telling her over and over how much he loved her, how perfect she was, how good she felt. Annie clung to him, moved with him, and felt something building inside her that she had not known was possible. When release finally washed over her in waves of sensation, she cried out his name, felt him follow her over the edge moments later, felt the way his body shuddered against hers as he spent himself inside her. Afterwards, they lay tangled together, their breathing gradually slowing, their hearts beating in rhythm. Jack traced lazy patterns on Annie's bare shoulder, pressed kisses to her temple, her cheek, her lips. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. "I am better than all right," Annie said honestly. "I did not know it could be like that. I did not know I could feel that way." "Good," Jack said with satisfaction, "because I plan on making you feel that way as often as possible for the rest of our lives." Annie laughed, then sobered. "Jack, I need to tell you something. My first husband, the one I left, I do not actually know if he is dead. I do not know if our marriage was ever legally ended. What if he comes looking for me someday? What if our marriage is not legitimate?" Jack was quiet for a moment, his hand stilling on her shoulder. "Then we will deal with it. If he comes, we will face him together. And if it turns out you need a divorce, we will get one. I do not care about the legalities, Annie. I care about you. In my heart, before God and everyone that matters, you are my wife. The paperwork is just details." "But what if he wants me back? What if he has some legal claim?" "No man has a claim on another person," Jack said firmly. "That is slavery, and we fought a war to end that. You are not property, Annie. You are a human being with the right to determine your own fate. If he shows up, I will make that very clear to him." Annie turned in his arms, pressed her face against his chest. "I am afraid. I am afraid that this happiness cannot last, that something will come along and destroy it." "Maybe something will," Jack said honestly. "Life is uncertain, and the world is often cruel. But Annie, we have each other. Whatever comes, we will face it together. That is the promise I made to you today, and I intend to keep it until my last breath." They slept wrapped around each other, and for the first time since she had fled Missouri, Annie slept without nightmares. The following weeks brought their own challenges. Jack found permanent work at the Bartlett Ranch, breaking horses and helping with the cattle. The pay was good enough to support them both, but the work was hard and often dangerous. Annie worried every time he left in the morning, feared that he would come home injured or not come home at all. She busied herself with making a home for them, renting a small house on the outskirts of town that was bigger and sturdier than her leaning cabin. She sewed curtains for the windows, planted a small garden in the back, learned to cook the meals Jack loved. It was strange at first playing house like a proper wife, but she found she enjoyed it, enjoyed the domesticity she had never been allowed to embrace in her first marriage. Some of the townspeople thawed toward her after the wedding. It was difficult to maintain hostility towards someone who was legally married to a man everyone liked and respected. Mrs. Chen from the boarding house started inviting her to the weekly gathering of women who met to sew and gossip. And while some of the members still treated Annie with coolness, others were cautiously friendly. Mrs. Henderson, however, remained implacable. She went out of her way to make cutting remarks whenever their paths crossed, to spread rumors about Annie's past, to remind everyone at every opportunity that some stains could not be washed away by a wedding ring. Annie tried to ignore it, tried to take the high road, but it wore on her, made her question whether she would ever truly be accepted in Georgetown. The confrontation came on a warm day in late summer. Annie was in the general store choosing fabric for a new shirt she was making for Jack, when Mrs. Henderson entered with her usual entourage of disapproving women. Annie braced herself, but tried to continue her shopping without acknowledging them. "Well, if it is not our local Scarlet woman, Mrs. Henderson said loudly, making sure everyone in the store could hear. "Tell me, Mrs. Everett, does your husband know about all the men you entertained before you managed to trap him into marriage? Does he know what you really are underneath that facade of respectability?" Annie's hands clenched on the fabric she was holding. "Mrs. Henderson, I have done nothing to you. I have never harmed you or spoken ill of you. Why do you persist in this vendetta?" "Because women like you make life harder for the rest of us, Mrs. Henderson spat. "Because you cheapen what it means to be a wife, to be a woman of virtue, because your very existence is an insult to those of us who have lived moral, decent lives." "Moral lives," Annie repeated slowly. "Tell me, Mrs. Henderson, is it moral to spread lies about someone you do not know? Is it moral to attempt to starve someone by denying them work? Is it moral to judge and condemn without mercy or compassion? Because if that is morality, then I want no part of it." "How dare you?" Mrs. Henderson breathed, her face flushing red. "How dare you speak to me in that tone, you filthy little whore?" The word hung in the air, ugly and venomous, and Annie felt something in her snap. All the months of enduring snide comments and hostile stares, all the years of being told she was less than human, all the suppressed rage at the injustice of it all came flooding to the surface. "I am not a whore," Annie said, her voice shaking with intensity. "I have never sold my body. I have never been unfaithful to my husband. My only crime was escaping a man who beat me, and apparently in your eyes that makes me worse than the man who raised his fist to me. You want to know what I really am, Mrs. Henderson? I am a survivor. I am someone who refused to die for the convenience of a man who did not value my life. I am someone who built a new existence from nothing and found love in the process. And yes, I am someone who will no longer bow and scrape for the approval of hypocrites who measure worth in dollars and family names rather than character and compassion." The store had gone completely silent. Every customer, every clerk was staring at them with wide eyes. Mrs. Henderson looked as though she had been slapped, her mouth opening and closing without sound. You cannot speak to me that way," she finally managed. "I just did," Annie said. "And I am done apologizing for my existence, Mrs. Henderson. I am done trying to make myself smaller so that you can feel bigger. I am Jack Everett's wife. I am a member of this community, and I will not be driven out by your poison." Annie turned and walked out of the store with her head high, leaving the fabric on the counter, leaving Mrs. Henderson standing in the middle of her spectators. Her hands were shaking and her heart was pounding, but she felt lighter than she had in years, as though she had finally shed a weight she had been carrying for too long. She was halfway home when she heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Mr. Bartlett jogging to catch up. "Mrs. Everett, wait." Annie stopped, uncertain. Mr. Bartlett was Jack's employer, and she feared she had just caused problems for her husband with her outburst. "I was in the store," Bartlett said, slightly out of breath. "I heard what happened between you and Mrs. Henderson. I want you to know that I think you handled yourself with considerable grace, all things considered." Annie blinked in surprise. "I lost my temper. I spoke harshly to a woman in public. That is not generally considered graceful behavior." "You stood up for yourself against someone who has been tormenting you for months," Bartlett corrected. "That took courage. Mrs. Henderson has long been a bully in this town, using her husband's position and her own sharp tongue to make life miserable for anyone she deems beneath her. It is about time someone called her on it." "I worry that I have made things difficult for Jack," Annie admitted. "You employ him, and I do not want my behavior to reflect poorly on him." Bartlett waved a hand dismissively. "Jack Everett is the best horseman I have ever employed. His wife's backbone is not going to change my opinion of his work. In fact, it makes me respect him more. Takes a confident man to marry a woman with that much fire in her." Annie felt tears prickling at her eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Bartlett. You have no idea what your support means to me." "My wife, Margaret, she has been wanting to invite you to dinner for weeks now," Bartlett said. "She has been shy about it, worried you might think she was being condescending, but I'm going to tell her to stop worrying and just extend the invitation. Would you and Jack come to supper next Sunday?" "We would be honored," Annie said, and meant it. That evening, when Jack came home dusty and tired from a long day at the ranch, Annie told him everything that had happened. She expected him to be angry or worried or disappointed. Instead, he laughed. "That is my wife," he said with obvious pride. "I wish I could have seen Henderson's face. She has had that coming for a long time." "You are not angry that I caused a scene?" "Angry? Annie, I am proud of you. Proud that you are finally standing up for yourself. Proud that you are refusing to let them make you small. That woman had no right to speak to you that way, and I am glad you told her so." He pulled her into his arms, kissed her soundly. "Besides, word will spread. People will hear about how you faced down Mrs. Henderson, and some of them, the ones with any sense, will realize that they have been wrong about you. It is a small town, Annie. Reputations can change faster than you think when someone challenges the status quo." Jack was right. Over the following weeks, Annie noticed a shift in how people treated her. Some still avoided her or treated her with coolness, but others, particularly the men who worked with Jack and the women who had witnessed the confrontation in the store, began to include her more deliberately in community activities. She would never be fully accepted by everyone in Georgetown, but she no longer felt like a complete pariah. The dinner with the Bartletts went well. Margaret Bartlett was a warm, talkative woman who seemed genuinely interested in getting to know Annie better. They discovered shared interests in gardening and books, and by the end of the evening, they had made plans to start a small lending library together, pooling their books and inviting other women in town to contribute and borrow. As autumn painted the aspens gold and the first snows dusted the peaks, Annie began to feel something she had never truly experienced before. She felt settled. She felt like Georgetown was becoming home, like she and Jack were building a life together that was solid and real and worth protecting. In October, she realized she had missed her monthly bleeding. She waited another month to be sure, then told Jack the news on a cold evening while they sat in front of the fireplace in their small house. "I am going to have a baby," she said simply, watching his face for his reaction. Jack's expression transformed, moving through surprise to joy to something like awe. "A baby! We are going to have a baby! Annie, are you certain?" "As certain as I can be without seeing a doctor. I have all the signs. I think I'm about 3 months along, which means the baby should come in the spring." Jack pulled her close, buried his face in her hair. "This is the best news I have ever gotten. We are going to be parents. I am going to be a father." "Are you happy?" Annie asked, needing to hear him say it. "Happy does not begin to cover it," Jack said fervently. "I am terrified and thrilled and grateful beyond words. Annie, we are going to have a family, a real family." They spent the evening talking about names and possibilities and all the ways their lives were about to change. Jack was adamant that Annie should take it easy, should not overwork herself, should let him handle the heavier chores around the house. Annie found his protectiveness endearing even when it was excessive. As her belly grew, so did the acceptance she felt from the community. Pregnancy, it seemed, was the ultimate marker of respectability, proof that she was fulfilling her proper role as a wife. Even Mrs. Henderson stopped her open hostility, though she never went so far as to be actively friendly. The baby came on a warm day in May, arriving after a labor that was long and difficult, but ultimately successful. Jack paced outside their bedroom while Mrs. Chen, who had some experience as a midwife, helped Annie through the birth. When he was finally allowed into the room, he found Annie exhausted but smiling, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in a blanket. "It is a boy," Annie said softly. "We have a son, Jack." Jack approached slowly, carefully, as though he were afraid of breaking something precious. He looked down at the small red face peeking out from the blanket, and his eyes filled with tears. "He is perfect. Annie, He is absolutely perfect. What should we name him? Annie asked. They had discussed names throughout the pregnancy, but never quite settled on one. Now, looking at their son, Jack said, "What about Thomas, after my grandfather? He was the only person in my family who ever showed me kindness." "Thomas Everett," Annie tested the name. "I like it." "Thomas it is." They spent the next weeks learning to be parents, stumbling through the challenges of caring for an infant, marveling at each small change and milestone. Jack proved to be a devoted father, rising in the middle of the night to walk with Thomas when he cried, talking to him constantly, even though the baby could not possibly understand, looking at him with such fierce love that it made Annie's heart ache. "I will never be like my father," Jack told her one night as he rocked Thomas in his arms. "I will never raise my hand to him in anger. I will never make him afraid of me. I will be the father I wished I had, the father he deserves." "I know you will," Annie said softly. "You are already an amazing father, Jack. Look at how he settles when you hold him. He knows he is safe with you." Life settled into a new rhythm. Jack continued his work at the ranch, coming home each evening to help with Thomas and spend time with his family. Annie found joy in motherhood that surprised her with its intensity, found that she loved even the difficult moments because they were part of this life she had built, this family she had created. When Thomas was 6 months old, Father O'Brien stopped by their house one afternoon with unexpected news. "Mrs. Everett, I hope I'm not intruding, but I thought you should know. I received a letter from a priest in Missouri. He made inquiries about you on behalf of someone claiming to be your husband." Annie felt her blood turn to ice. "My first husband. He is looking for me?" "He was," Father O'Brien said gently. "Past tense. The priest wrote to tell me that the man in question died 3 weeks ago. Pneumonia, apparently. He wanted to find you to deliver the news because there were some estate matters to settle." Annie sat down heavily, Thomas still in her arms. "He is dead. He is really dead." "According to the documentation the priest sent, yes, which means that you are now legally free from that marriage. There is no question about the legitimacy of your union with Mr. Everett." Annie felt a strange mixture of emotions, relief, guilt, grief for a life that might have been if her first husband had been a different man. "Thank you for telling me, Father. I appreciate you bringing the news in person." After Father O'Brien left, Annie sat in the rocking chair with Thomas and tried to process what she was feeling. When Jack came home that evening, she told him everything. "How do you feel?" Jack asked carefully, kneeling beside the rocking chair. "Free," Annie said slowly. "I feel free, and I feel guilty for feeling free because a man is dead, and I should probably feel something more than relief. But Jack, I spent years being afraid that he would find me, that he would drag me back, that I would never be truly safe. And now I am. Now I can stop looking over my shoulder." "You do not have to feel guilty," Jack said firmly. "That man made his own choices, treated you in ways no person should be treated. You are allowed to feel relieved that he can never hurt you again. You are allowed to feel free." Annie kissed him, kissed Thomas's soft baby head, and let herself feel the full weight of what freedom meant. The years that followed were good ones, better than Annie had ever imagined possible. She and Jack had 2 more children, a daughter they named Sarah after the woman whose death had motivated Jack to stand up for Annie in that store, and another son they named William. Their small house became too crowded, so Jack and some friends from the ranch spent a summer building a larger home on a piece of land the Bartletts sold them at a generous price. Annie's lending library grew into a small actual library, housed in a room at the church and run by a committee of women who had once shunned her but now called her friend. She never became close with Mrs. Henderson, but they reached a state of cold civility that was an improvement over open hostility. Jack's reputation as a horseman spread beyond Georgetown, and he started his own business training horses for ranches across Colorado. The work was steady and profitable, and they were able to save money, to buy small luxuries, to provide their children with opportunities neither of them had experienced growing up. Thomas grew into a serious boy who loved books and numbers, who was gentle with his younger siblings and fascinated by the natural world. Sarah was wild and fearless, constantly climbing trees and catching frogs, making her father laugh with her antics. William was the baby, sweet-tempered and affectionate, clinging to Annie's skirts and following Jack around the property like a small shadow. On a summer evening when Thomas was 12 and William was 5, the family gathered on the porch of their house to watch the sunset paint the mountains in shades of rose and gold. Thomas was reading aloud from a book of adventure stories, Sarah was weaving flower crowns from the daisies that grew in the yard, and William was tucked against Jack's side, fighting sleep. Annie looked at her family, at this impossible constellation of love and happiness, and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. "Jack," she said softly, "do you remember that first day in Henderson's store?" Jack looked over at her, his gray eyes warm. "Every detail. You were standing at the counter with your shoulders back and your chin up, refusing to be made small. I fell a little bit in love with you right then, though I did not know it yet. They said my soul was lost," Annie remembered. "Mrs. Henderson, the preacher, so many people. They looked at me and decided I was beyond redemption." "They were wrong," Jack said simply. "Your soul was never lost, Annie. It was just misunderstood by people who did not have the capacity to see it clearly. But I saw it. I saw your strength and your courage and your fundamental goodness. I saw you, really saw you, and I knew that you were worth fighting for." "You saved me," Annie said, her voice thick with emotion. "No," Jack corrected gently. "You saved yourself. You left a bad situation. You survived against impossible odds. You built a life from nothing. I just had the good fortune to recognize what an extraordinary woman you are. I just loved you, Annie. That is all I ever did." "That is everything," Annie said. Thomas looked up from his book. "Papa, tell us the story about how you met Mama, the real story, not the one you tell when other people are listening." Jack and Annie exchanged a glance, and Annie nodded. Their children were old enough now to understand, old enough to hear the truth about who their parents were and where they had come from. So Jack told them about the store and the confrontation, about the women who had tried to run Annie out of town, about the choice he had made to stand with her against the judgment of people who thought they had the right to declare who was worthy and who was not. He told them about falling in love, about the wedding, about the early days when they were building their life together against considerable odds. The children listened with wide eyes, and when Jack finished, Sarah said, "People were mean to Mama because she left a bad marriage? That does not make sense." "No, it does not," Jack agreed, "but people are often cruel when they are afraid. They were afraid of what your mother represented, which was the idea that women did not have to accept mistreatment, that they could choose their own paths. That scared people who had built their lives around very rigid ideas of how things should be." "But you were not scared," Thomas said, looking at his father with something like hero worship in his young eyes. "Oh, I was terrified," Jack admitted, "but I was more afraid of losing your mother than I was of what people might say about me. Love makes you brave, I think. Or maybe it just makes the scary things seem worth facing." Annie reached over and took Jack's free hand, squeezed it tightly. "It does," she agreed. "Love makes everything worth facing." William had fallen asleep against Jack's side, his small face peaceful in the fading light. Jack carefully adjusted his position so the boy was more comfortable, then looked out at the mountains that rose around their home. "You know what I think about sometimes, Courtois?" he said. "I think about all the paths I could have taken, all the decisions I could have made differently. If I had passed by that store without going in, if I had not spoken up when Henderson was being cruel, if I had listened to the gossip and stayed away from you, any of those choices would have led to a completely different life. And I cannot imagine a life better than this one." "Me either," Annie said softly. "Even with all the hardship, all the judgment, all the difficulty, I would not change a single thing, because it all led here, to this porch, to these children, to this family." to you. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Annie leaned her head against Jack's shoulder and felt the solid, steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek. She thought about the woman she had been when she first arrived in Georgetown, frightened and alone, and convinced that she was exactly what people said she was. She thought about how Jack had seen through all of that to the person underneath, how he had loved her not despite her past but including it, how he had given her the space and safety to become who she was always meant to be. Her soul had never been lost, just as he had said. It had simply been waiting for someone who knew how to recognize it, someone who could see past the surface to the truth beneath. And in seeing her clearly, in loving her wholly, Jack had helped her see herself the same way. The following years brought their share of challenges. There were harsh winters and difficult harvests, illnesses that frightened them and financial worries that kept them up at night. Jack broke his leg badly when a horse threw him and spent months recovering, frustrated by his inability to work. Annie developed a persistent cough one winter that took weeks to clear, leaving Jack terrified of losing her. But through it all, they had each other. They had the family they had built, the community they had earned through persistence and integrity, the life they had carved out of circumstances that should have defeated them. Thomas grew up to become a teacher, opening a small school in Georgetown that educated children from all backgrounds, including the Chinese workers and the few Native American families who still lived in the area. Sarah married a geologist and moved to Denver, though she visited often with her own children in tow, still wild and laughing. William took over his father's horse training business, showing the same gift with animals that Jack had possessed. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Jack and Annie took a rare day away from work and family responsibilities to ride up into the mountains together. They left their horses to graze in a meadow thick with wildflowers and sat together on a flat rock overlooking the valley where Georgetown nestled among the peaks. 25 years, Annie mused, leaning against Jack's solid warmth. A quarter of a century? How did we get so old, Jack Everett? Speak for yourself, Jack said with mock indignation. I am in my prime, distinguished, not old. Annie laughed, kissed his bearded cheek. Distinguished it is then, though I notice your hair is more gray than dark these days. Only adds to my charm, Jack insisted, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. Besides, you have a few silver threads yourself, Mrs. Everett. They make you look wise. We have earned every one of these gray hairs, Annie said, sobering slightly. It has not been an easy life, has it? Not always. No, Jack agreed, but it has been a good life, a life worth living. Annie, I meant what I said in that letter I wrote you, back before we were married. You are the best thing that ever happened to me. These 25 years with you have been the greatest gift I could have asked for. What letter? Annie asked. Annie. Confused. Jack, you never wrote me a letter. Jack looked puzzled. I suppose I did not, did I? We were together so quickly, there was never need for correspondence, but I wrote you one in my head during those first days when I was trying to sort out what I was feeling. Want to hear it now, 25 years too late? Always, Annie said, turning to face him more fully. Jack was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. When he spoke, his voice was serious but warm. Dear Annie, I do not know if this makes sense, but I feel like I have been waiting my whole life to meet you. Not you specifically, because I did not know you existed, but the feeling of rightness that comes with being near you. You make me want to be braver and kinder and more honest than I have been. You make me believe that the world is not as cruel as I had begun to think it was. Falling in love with you is like coming home after years of wandering. Whatever happens, wherever this goes, I want you to know that knowing you has changed me for the better. With all my love and admiration, Jack. Annie felt tears streaming down her face, felt the words settling into all the places in her heart that still sometimes doubted, still sometimes wondered if she deserved this happiness. That is beautiful, Jack. I wish I had something as lovely to say in return. You do not need pretty words, Jack said. brushing away her tears with his thumb. You have given me a life beyond anything I dreamed possible. 3 beautiful children who are kind and strong and full of potential. A home filled with laughter and love, partnership and friendship and passion, all rolled into one extraordinary package. You have loved me through my mistakes and my moments of weakness. You have built a place in this world where I feel safe being exactly who I am. What could you possibly say that would mean more than that? They sat together as the sun moved across the sky, talking about their children and their plans for the future, about the business William was building and the grandchildren Sarah kept promising were coming soon, about whether Thomas would ever find someone to marry or if he was content with his books and his students. They talked about the changes they had seen in Georgetown over the years, how the silver boom was starting to fade, how the town was slowly becoming something different from what it had been when they first met. "Do you ever regret it?" Annie asked, as the afternoon light began to slant golden across the valley. "Marrying me, taking on all the complications that came with it? You could have had an easier life with someone else?" Jack turned to look at her, and there was no hesitation in his eyes, no shadow of doubt. "Annie, listen to me. I have never, not for one single moment, regretted choosing you. Yes, it was complicated. Yes, there were challenges. But nothing easy has ever been worth having. You are worth every difficulty, every obstacle, every moment of uncertainty. You are worth everything." "I love you," Annie said simply. "I love you more now than I did on our wedding day, which I would not have thought possible. But love is like that, is it not? It grows deeper with time, with shared experience, with all the small moments that add up to a life." "It is," Jack agreed, "and I love you, Annie Everett. I love you today, and I will love you tomorrow, and I will love you until my last breath leaves my body." They rode back down the mountain as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of fire and amber. When they reached their home, they found it full of people. Their children had conspired with friends and neighbors to throw them a surprise party, filling the house and yard with everyone who had been part of their life in Georgetown. Even Mrs. Henderson was there, though she stayed near the edges of the gathering and did not speak directly to Annie. Her presence was acknowledgement enough, Annie thought, a recognition that time and circumstance had softened even the hardest hearts. Father O'Brien, now old and white-haired but still spry, gave a toast. "To Jack and Annie Everett, who have shown us all what it means to love with courage and conviction. When they first came together, there were those in this community who judged harshly, who declared their union ill-advised at best. I am grateful that they proved us all wrong, that they built a marriage and a family that stands as a testament to the power of seeing people clearly, of loving without reservation, of refusing to let the narrow judgments of others determine your path. May we all learn from their example." The party went late into the night, filled with music and dancing and laughter. Annie danced with Jack, with her sons, with old friends who had stood by her during the difficult early days. She felt surrounded by love, held in a web of connection and community that she had never imagined possible when she was that frightened woman fleeing Missouri all those years ago. As the last guests were leaving, Mrs. Chen pulled Annie aside. "Mrs. Everett, I want to tell you something. When you first came to Georgetown, when people were saying terrible things about you, I told my husband that you had a good soul. He asked me how I could tell, and I said it was in your eyes. You looked like someone who had suffered but not been broken, someone who still had hope even when the world gave you little reason for it. I was right about you." "Thank you, Mrs. Chen," Annie said, embracing the older woman. "Your kindness during that time meant more than you know. You and your husband were among the few who saw me as a person rather than a problem." "People fear what they do not understand," Mrs. Chen said philosophically, "and they understand very little, most of them. But time teaches, and you have been a good teacher. You have shown this town what strength looks like, what dignity looks like. That is a gift." After everyone had gone and the house was quiet again, Jack and Annie stood on their porch and looked out at the mountains silhouetted against the star-filled sky. "A good party," Jack said, pulling Annie close. The best, Annie agreed. Though I am exhausted now. Who knew celebrating could be so tiring? That is because we are getting old, remember? Distinguished and wise, but also old. Jack kissed the top of her head. Ready for bed, Mrs. Everett? More than ready. They walked inside together past the evidence of the evening's festivities, up the stairs to the bedroom they had shared for 25 years. As they prepared for sleep, moving through the familiar rhythms of their nightly routine, Annie felt a profound sense of contentment settle over her. This was her life. This house. And this man. And this family they had built together. This was the future that had seemed impossible when she was young and frightened and running from a past that threatened to define her forever. This was what happened when someone looked at you and saw not what the world said you were, but what you actually were, soul deep and true. She climbed into bed beside Jack, fitted herself against his side the way she had done thousands of times before. His arm came around her automatically, holding her close, and she listened to his breathing slow as sleep claimed him. Thank you, she whispered into the darkness, though she was not entirely sure who she was thanking. Jack for seeing her. God for bringing them together, herself for having the courage to run, to survive, to accept love when it was offered, all of the above perhaps. The years continued to unfold. Annie and Jack grew older together, their bodies accumulating the aches and pains of lives lived fully and actively. They welcomed grandchildren, 7 of them eventually, and the house that had once been too quiet when the children moved out became filled with young voices and laughter again during visits. Jack finally retired from active horse training when he was 60, passing the business fully to William, but still spending time in the barns, still unable to completely step away from the work he loved. Annie continued her library work and added community organizing to her activities, helping to establish a fund to help women in difficult situations, women like she had been when she first arrived in Georgetown. The town itself changed around them. The silver mines began to play out, and Georgetown's population declined as people moved away in search of new opportunities. But a core remained. The families who had put down roots too deep to easily transplant, and Annie and Jack were firmly part of that core. On a cool autumn day in their 43rd year of marriage, Jack collapsed while working in the barn. William found him and ran for the doctor, but by the time Annie arrived, breathless and terrified, Jack was conscious again and insisting that he was fine, that it was nothing, that everyone was making a fuss over nothing. The doctor disagreed. Mr. Everett, your heart is not what it used to be. You need to take things easier, avoid strenuous activity, get more rest. I am serious about this. Jack grumbled but agreed, and for a few weeks he was careful, following the doctor's orders. But gradually he began to push the boundaries again, unwilling or unable to accept his body's limitations. Annie watched with growing worry, but she knew Jack well enough to know that nagging would only make him more stubborn. One morning in early spring, Annie woke to find Jack's side of the bed cold. She rose and found him sitting in his chair by the window, watching the sunrise paint the mountains gold. Jack, are you all right? He turned to look at her, and there was something in his expression that made her heart clench. Annie, come here. She went to him, let him pull her down onto his lap the way he used to when they were young. His arms came around her, held her close. I love you, he said quietly. I need you to know that, need you to hear it one more time. You have been the great joy of my life, Annie Everett. Every day with you has been a gift. You are scaring me, Annie said, pulling back to look at his face. Jack, what is wrong? Nothing is wrong. Everything is right. I woke up this morning and felt grateful. Felt like I needed to say it out loud, make sure you knew. He kissed her gently. I am the luckiest man who ever lived, because I got to love you. Annie held him tight, tried to shake off the feeling of foreboding that had settled over her. You are going to be fine. The doctor said you just need to be careful, to rest more. We have years left, Jack, years and years. I know, he said. But something in his voice suggested he was not entirely convinced. They had 3 more years together. 3 years of watching grandchildren grow, of sitting on the porch in the evenings and remembering, of small touches and familiar conversations and the deep comfort that comes from knowing another person completely. Jack had another small collapse, then another, each one stealing a bit more of his vitality. The end, when it came, was peaceful. Jack had been feeling poorly all day, and that evening Annie helped him to bed earlier than usual. He held her hand as they talked quietly about nothing in particular, about whether they should plant tomatoes or beans in the garden that year, about whether Thomas's newest student showed promise. "Annie," Jack said suddenly, his voice serious, "if something happens to me, I need you to promise me something." "Nothing is going to happen," Annie said automatically, but Jack squeezed her hand. "Listen, if something happens, I need you to promise that you will not waste time grieving, that you will keep living, keep loving, keep being exactly who you are. You are too vibrant, too full of life to shut yourself away. Promise me." "Jack, please, you are frightening me." "Promise me, Annie." "I promise," she said, though the words felt like ashes in her mouth. "But you're not going anywhere. We have years left." Jack smiled at her, that slow, warm smile that had first made her believe love might be possible. "We have had a lifetime, Annie. A beautiful, imperfect, absolutely perfect lifetime. If this is all we get, it was more than enough." He fell asleep holding her hand, and sometime in the night, his breathing simply stopped. Annie knew the moment it happened, felt the change in the air, the terrible stillness that replaced the familiar sound of his breathing. She lay there in the darkness, still holding his hand, and felt her world shift on its axis. Jack Everett was buried in the Georgetown cemetery on a hill overlooking the valley, with half the town attending the service. Father O'Brien, himself very old now, spoke about a life well lived, about a man who had known instinctively what so many had to be taught, that every person carried equal worth regardless of their circumstances. Annie stood between her children and watched them lower her husband into the ground, and she felt as though part of her was being buried with him. She had promised to keep living, but in that moment, she could not imagine how. The weeks that followed were dark ones. Annie moved through her days like a ghost, performing necessary tasks but feeling disconnected from everything around her. Her children worried, tried to draw her out, but she could not seem to find her way back to herself without Jack. It was Mrs. Chen who finally broke through her grief. The old woman appeared at Annie's door one morning with a basket of food and a determined expression. "Mrs. Everett, you are going to eat this food, and then you are going to come with me. No arguments." "Mrs. Chen, I appreciate your concern, but I'm not fit company for anyone right now." "Nonsense. Grief is a journey, not a destination. You cannot stay in this dark place forever. Mr. Everett would not want it." Mrs. Chen bustled into the house, set out the food, and waited until Annie had eaten at least some of it. Then she took Annie's arm and marched her outside. They walked through the town, and Mrs. Chen pointed out changes, developments, things Annie had been too lost in grief to notice. "Look, the library has added a whole new room. The children you helped teach to read are bringing their own children now. This is your legacy, Mrs. Everett. This is what you and Mr. Everett built together. Do not turn your back on it because he is gone." The words were harsh but necessary. Annie felt something in her chest loosen slightly, felt the fog of grief lift just enough to let in a small shaft of light. "I miss him so much, Mrs. Chen. I do not know how to be myself without him." "You were yourself before you met him," Mrs. Chen said practically. "A strong woman who survived impossible things. That strength did not come from him, though perhaps he helped you recognize it. You are still that woman, Mrs. Everett. You just need to remember how to find her again." It took time, but gradually Annie did find her way back. She threw herself into her community work, expanding the fund for women in need, volunteering at the library, spending time with her grandchildren who helped fill the empty spaces in her heart with their energy and laughter. She never stopped missing Jack, never stopped feeling the Jack-shaped hole in her life. But she learned to live around it, to carry the grief alongside joy and purpose. On what would have been their 50th wedding anniversary, Annie climbed the hill to the cemetery and sat beside Jack's grave. She brought wildflowers, the kind that grew in the meadow where they had sat on their 25th anniversary, and arranged them carefully in the vase built into the headstone. "Hello, my love," she said quietly. 50 years. Can you believe it? Well, 46 together and these 4 without you, but I am counting them all because you are still with me in every way that matters. Thomas is thinking about retiring from teaching. Sarah is a grandmother now herself, can you imagine? And William just trained a horse for the governor of Colorado. The governor, Jack. Your son is training horses for the governor. She talked to him for a long time, catching him up on all the news, telling him about the changes in Georgetown, about the new families and the old ones, about the ways the world was transforming around them. When she finally fell silent, she sat listening to the wind in the pines and remembering. "They said my soul was lost," she said finally. "All those years ago, when I first came here, they looked at me and decided I was beyond saving, but you knew different. You saw me clearly when everyone else saw only their own assumptions. You knew my soul was never lost, that I was exactly where I needed to be, that I was finding my way home even if no one else could see it." Annie stood, brushed the dirt from her skirt. "Thank you for that, Jack. Thank you for seeing me, for loving me, for giving me a life beyond anything I imagined possible. Thank you for our children and our years together and every small moment that added up to our lifetime. I will carry you with me until the day I join you here. And when that day comes, I will find you again. I have no doubt about that. Wherever souls go when they leave this earth, yours will be waiting for mine, and we will have eternity to keep loving each other." She walked back down the hill to the town, to the life she had built and the people who needed her. She had promises to keep, to Jack and to herself. She had living to do even in grief, even in absence, even in the empty spaces where his presence used to be. Annie lived another 8 years after Jack's death, years that were busy and full even without him. She watched her children become elders themselves, watched her grandchildren grow into adults, welcomed great-grandchildren into the world. She remained active in Georgetown's community until her own health began to fail, until her body finally decided it had carried her far enough. On a warm summer evening in 1930, surrounded by 3 generations of the family she and Jack had created, Annie closed her eyes for the last time. Her last words were, "I am coming home," and those who heard them liked to think she was talking to Jack, that she saw him waiting for her on the other side of whatever veil separates this life from the next. They buried her beside Jack on the hill, and the headstone read, "Annie Preston Everett, beloved wife, mother, grandmother. Her soul was never lost, only misunderstood." It was what Jack had always said about her, and it seemed fitting that those words should mark her final resting place. The story of Jack and Annie became something of a legend in Georgetown, passed down through generations as an example of what love could be when it was stripped of pretense and judgment. People told their children about the cowboy who had stood up for a woman everyone else had written off, about the love that had grown between 2 damaged people who found healing in each other, about the family they had built, and the legacy they had left. Mrs. Henderson's great-granddaughter would eventually write a book about the early days of Georgetown, and in it she included a full chapter about Annie Preston Everett. "My great-grandmother was wrong about many things," Shemji wrote in the introduction, but perhaps nothing more profoundly than her treatment of Annie Preston. History has a way of clarifying our mistakes, of showing us where we failed to live up to our ideals. Annie Preston's story is a reminder that the soul's worth cannot be measured by social standing or respectability, but only by the content of one's character, By that measure, Annie Preston Everett was one of the richest women who ever lived. In the end, that was the truth that mattered. Not the judgment of small men and frightened women, not the gossip and speculation and cruelty that had greeted Annie when she first arrived in Georgetown. What mattered was the life she had lived, the love she had shared, the family she had raised, and the community she had helped build. What mattered was that one man had looked at her and seen not a fallen woman but a survivor, not a lost soul but one that had always known exactly where it belonged. Jack had been right from the beginning. Annie's soul was never lost. It had simply been waiting for someone who knew how to recognize it, someone brave enough to stand up and declare that the emperor had no clothes, that the judgment was unwarranted, that the woman standing at the edge of town deserved the same dignity and respect as anyone else. In loving Annie, Jack had given her back to herself. And in accepting that love, Annie had given Jack a reason to believe that the world was better than he had feared, that kindness mattered, that standing up for what was right could change lives in ways both small and profound. Their love story ended, as all love stories must, with death and separation. But the impact of that love rippled outward through time, through children and grandchildren, through the people whose lives they touched, through the example they set of what it meant to love courageously in a world that often rewarded cowardice and conformity. And in Georgetown, Colorado, in a small cemetery on a hill, two headstones stand side by side, marking the resting place of two people who proved that the heart knows truths the world often refuses to acknowledge, that souls are never truly lost, only waiting to be found, that love, real love, sees clearly and judges kindly and endures beyond reason or expectation, that sometimes when you meet the right person at the right time, everything changes, and that change, difficult as it might be, is always worth it in the end.